Much like most people with a Netflix subscription that they constantly forget about, I've watched a lot of true crime. Making a Murderer, The Staircase, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, I've seen it all. And let me be the first to say, I'm still not convinced that rabbit didn't do nothing. The problem I have whenever I'm watching one of these shows is that I always end up having the same thought. Fuck, it's hard to kill someone and get away with it. Like, not only can your phone pinpoint exactly where you are at any given time, but they've also started solving cold cases by getting partial matches with people who weren't even alive. If you haven't heard of the Golden State Killer, I mean, you can take a stab at what he was known for, but what's interesting about him was that even though he stopped his killing spree in 1986, he was only considered a serious suspect in the case in 2017. As part of this new thing that at least the FBI has started doing, where they go to these websites like Ancestry.com, take the data that they have based on the DNA that people voluntarily provide that partially matches with the killers, and then use it to map out who was alive while the crimes are committed. Now, is this legal? No, genuinely, I'm asking. Like most things that these weird American government agencies do, I don't even think they know if what they did was legal. Either way, the reality is, if you have a relative with too much time on their hands, you're not getting away with anything close to what the Golden State Killer did. At this point, the only way for you to truly beat the system is if by the time the cops work out you're the killer, you're dead. Or at the very least, aren't able to be found. In 2023, 56,000 people were reported missing in Australia. In the US, it's closer to 600,000. For most people, if you just one day happen to disappear, sure, your family and whoever are probably going to kick up a fuss, but not the police. To them, you're realistically just another statistic unless you've done a big murder. In that case, they're coming for you. And most of the time, you're going to be caught. If only we, the innocent until proven guilty, had some kind of handbook that could outline exactly what we would need to how to disappear completely and never be found is a book written by Doug Richmond, which is described as the definitive handbook on disappearing. Described as by me, by the way, this book is the closest thing I could find to a definitive handbook. According to this how-to, the most important part of pulling off a disappearance is the planning you put in before it. As producer Mike Green once said in an extremely deep cut from the 2010s emo scene, poor prior planning leads to piss poor performance. And how right that man is. Also, at least 150,000 people would have seen the doco in that part that I'm referencing. Surely at least one of you manages to stumble across this video. Let me know in the comments. The point is, to successfully disappear, you need to be ready for it. And before we get into exactly how he says you should get ready to disappear, allow me to read the legal sounding disclaimer the publisher put into page 1 and pretend like that in any way also extends to me. Warning, the publisher produces this book for informational purposes and under no circumstances advises, encourages, or approves of the use of this material in any manner. Or in other words, don't try this at home. Basically, the book breaks down disappearing into 3 main points: planning, executing, and surviving. Planning was something I never really even thought about with people who disappear, but unless you're the victim of some crime, there is always going to be at least some kind of planning that goes into a person going missing. The first thing most people would probably think of when confronted with the thought of disappearing is, where would you go? As much as it seems like a good idea to go to some small town in Whoop Whoop, chances are it's actually worse for you than a big city. If we look at Victoria, the greatest state on earth in my opinion, Doug writes that it would be much easier to fade into the background in a city like Melbourne with roughly 150,000 people living in it, compared to some small town like Turin that only has a population of about 1,700. I may have taken some creative liberties with the cities and towns he talks about. It's called world building, sweetheart, okay? Look it up. But with a big city comes big expenses. As most people probably haven't heard enough yet, there's actually a global cost of living crisis right now. Not everyone can afford to start over with a new life after having committed several crimes. And my only argument against that is, have you ever heard of a cashy before? Those who haven't, it's what Australians call it when you want to get a job done but don't want to pay a whole heap of money for it. So instead of calling a professional, what you do is you get your dropkick friend who used to smoke bongs instead of going to class, who is now an apprentice, to come around and do some work on a house or car that they're not legally allowed to. You pay them with cash, job done, you both move on. According to Doug Richmond, Dougie if you will, labouring jobs are some of the easiest to start working at with very little documentation. And that's because most smaller companies are constantly flooded with work and are always looking for a way to ease that pressure. Granted, you'll probably need a lot of documents if you walk into a union site, but you can slowly build up to that. And the way you would do this is through probably the most important part of the entire planning stage, creating a new identity. Now you could go full Mr. Thompson on this step and create a new identity from the ground up, but without without the help of the government to supply you with documents to support your new identity, you're probably not going to get very far. And that's why in the book, an alternative option is offered as the safest bet: stealing a dead person's identity. Look, I'll be honest here, I think this might be one of the most outdated parts of the book, because he does basically say that if someone was born in a rural town and died in a big city, their death probably wouldn't be reported back home because of how disconnected those two places are. And in the modern age, this just isn't true. But to be fair to the naysayers, it's not the only part of Doug's plan that seems just a little bit outdated. In a later chapter talking about how you could travel domestically while missing, he says that ticket agents don't care what a passenger calls himself, as long as he pays for the fare up front. 1986. Such a simpler time. Back when modern airport security would look like something written only in 1984, and Al-Qaeda was still 2 years away from being formed. Isn't it kind of crazy to think about how 19 randos from the Middle East completely and irreversibly changed air travel for everyone? Did you know that airports recommend arriving 3 hours before an international flight so you can get through all the security now? Before 9/11, getting to the airport an hour early was giving yourself enough time to get through all the security and also buy yourself some cheap booze. Why couldn't Osama have thought of the real victims he was leaving behind? Generations of very lazy people forced to stand for a few hours. But what was I saying? Oh, yeah, okay. So this book is probably outdated. Kind of like me complaining about airports like I'm a comedian from the 90s. I mean, come on. What is the deal with airline food? And why, despite airplanes being half of Jerry Seinfeld's act, has he not gotten to the bottom of it yet? Stop making shit movies about your clearly autistic obsession with cereal and tell me how the fuck a ham and cheese toastie costs $11. Jetstar, you're not the fucking coffee club. You're the airline for cheap cunts, and every single one of your flight attendants treat the passengers exactly like that. Anyway, back on topic, how to steal a dead man's life. I had a Google to see how easy it is to actually get a birth certificate without any documentation, and at least in Victoria, it seems like getting any ID is kind of like the tattoo any Gen Y metalhead has of the snake eating itself. To get a birth certificate, you need to provide a driver's license and or a passport. To get a passport, you need to provide a birth certificate and or a driver's license. To get a driver's license, you need to let the driving instructor jack you off like Simon did. But since sometimes people genuinely don't have any ID and need to get a copy of their birth certificate, you can always give the Department of Births, Marriages and Deaths a statutory declaration. All a stat dec is basically just a written statement from you saying, yes, I am John Stewart Smith. Can I have my birth certificate now? Once you have this, applying for other documents gets so much easier considering how much weight a birth certificate carries. I do want to add, and I'm only saying this because of how dodgy it feels to basically just go, yeah, just lie and pretend to be a dead guy. Where's the harm in that, huh? If you're caught lying on a stat dec, you'll be fined up to $100,000 and you could also go to jail for up to 5 years. So maybe don't do that because some random guy on YouTube made it sound fun, you know? Okay, but now that you've started to get the ID together for your new life, you've picked out where you're going to flee to, and you have a rough idea of how you're going to make money once you're there, the only thing left to do once you feel like you've prepared all you can is to follow through. This is a part of the whole journey that Doug doesn't really touch on, mainly because the people who he spoke to for the book all kind of just one day walked out of the house and never came back. Like, no joke, I think about 3 different people he spoke to legitimately did the I'm just going to the store for cigarettes bit. One thing he does say though is that once you've committed to this idea of leaving, it is extremely important that you never look back. If you hadn't already, you've committed a very big crime by now, which is stealing someone's identity. And the longer you do it, the more charges will be piled up against you if you're ever caught. And the best way to avoid being caught would be to never contact anyone from or speak about your past life. In the wise words of Doug Richmond, the old gag about the fastest methods of news dissemination being telephone and tell a woman is as true today as when it was coined some 100 years or so ago. Look, either way, this is the rest of your life. In the book, it said that you don't even really need to disguise yourself because most people who aren't looking for you probably aren't going to recognize you in a city that they don't expect you to be in. But if you were adamant on being disguised, all you really need to do is the classic Superman technique. If you wore glasses before, don't anymore. Something interesting that I didn't think of though was how dyeing your hair might actually not be the best way to disguise yourself. This is because as soon as your roots start showing, everyone around you is going to know your actual hair color, and then what's the point of re-dyeing it? Instead, Doug offers a much simpler solution. Just go bald and maintain that, and you're already going to look drastically different than the person anyone back home would be looking for. Given enough time and as you settle into your new life, you're probably going to be fine. Again, depending on who's looking for you, because there was a case out of China where the CCTV cameras that they have managed to find a fugitive all on their own. They did this by having all of their feeds go through an AI program that determines how closely a person resembles someone else, and they managed to get a match on a woman who had been missing for years. I feel like that and the DNA thing are two really weird points where it's like, this seems very invasive, but also it's stopping serial killers from getting away with it, right? Like, there's something in me that thinks, this seems like a step too far. But at the moment, it's being used for like a solely good purpose, so I don't know. It's just really interesting to me to think about that. Maybe give it a couple years and then, you know, it'll be used for, I don't know, some shit. I think what probably interests me the most about the people who disappear is what it must be like for them the very next morning after they've left. If you've ever moved house or ended a relationship, that feeling of the morning after, knowing that today there is something very different than the however many months or years that came before it, there's always a strange kind of feeling. And the idea that someone could have that, but rather than it being just one aspect of their lives, it is their entire life in the most literal sense being changed, it must be such a bizarre feeling to have. And when you add the idea of how life still goes on, it's really interesting to me. Like at some point that next day, the person is going to sit down and order themselves a meal, and at some point you're gonna have to ask yourself, did I do the right thing? And look, this is probably a bit different when you're on the run from the cops or whatever, but even then, those people are still going to have some downtime at some point, and I can only imagine that they're still going to reflect on themselves too. And after writing this book, Doug did some reflecting of his own, which I'd really like to share with you. On rereading the manuscript, I've come to the conclusion that perhaps it is the men who don't disappear who should be pitied. They are the grouchy, embittered, ulcer-ridden men who seize every day bound by ties of duty, loyalty, and fear to a life they detest, hopeless in their 40s, old before their time in their 50s. In this age of loud and vocal minorities, the disappearees in our midst, and they are legion, let's not forget that, they are legion, who constitute a minority group in every sense of the word, are refreshing in that they aren't hollering for handouts, howling about discrimination, or complaining about their lack of opportunity. And though in modern society, the problems of an adult with no paper background are manifold and pressing, these people go calmly about overcoming their problems unaided, alone, and with a complete absence of bitching. And I believe it can be truly said that they are the only group that has come anywhere near to beating the system. I salute them. Look, the end is fucked, but he's clearly done a lot of research on how to disappear. Like, I think despite his view on minorities that he wrote in the 80s, right? Like, that's 40 years ago. We can still consider him an expert in this specific topic. Like, everyone is entitled to a change of mind. Like, if Mark Wahlberg can find God, I'm sure Doug Richmond can be civil to his black neighbor. Then again, his name does sound like the name of a racist. Like, if you were scrolling through a list of prosecutions over the January 6th thing, doesn't seem that out of place, does it? Howard Richardson, Thomas Webster, Doug Richmond, yeah, it checks out. To be fair, we don't know what Doug thinks now. I cannot find a single trace of him online besides this book, so who knows? Maybe he took his own advice and is now some chippy in Chicago. Or maybe he's dead. His first book was published in 1972, so assuming that at minimum he was 18 when that was published, it means that he's gotta be in his 70s at least. Like, if that man isn't dead from natural causes, it's safe to assume that COVID took him out. Like, this book doesn't scream pro-government sentiment, you know? In any case, now you know what it takes to disappear. And unlike me, you didn't hear about it all from a possible racist. You heard about it from a confirmed racist. I hope you enjoyed this video and found the topic as fascinating as I did. Subscribe if you want to see another video where I find some weird topic that personally interests me and I just let it consume my life for a week. Thank you very much again for watching. Have a good one, and I'll see you later.